Welcome to Support Life, a program focusing on current social issues from a life-affirming perspective. I'm Gavin Baulch and my guest today is Daniel Attard. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you for having me on the program.
I was going to introduce you as a sociological aware person.
Well, I do my best. I am studying sociology at university here in Melbourne, but we do our best to be aware of all those issues.
Oh, well, you should be a good student of me today.
Thank you.
Now, Western suburbs are a very important kind of background for you. Tell me about it.
So, well, basically, typical upbringing. Grew up in the western suburb of Keilor Park. There, I'm the youngest of 5 siblings, so both parents of Maltese heritage. They came over from Malta in their early years in the late 60s and settled out in the eastern side of Melbourne at first and then migrated west in their own time. And as I say, the rest is history from that perspective. But then I married a Maltese woman and we've got 4.5 children now, and we started our married life in St Albans and migrated to Deer Park. So it's taken me the better part of 35 years to move from Keilor Park to Deer Park, about 3 kilometres down the Western Ring Road.
Awesome. That's about the length of Malta, isn't it?
Absolutely. You can walk across it from one side to the other in well under a day. So, geography is not a difficult subject to study in Malta. Great.
Now, you come from a family of 5, and 5 meaning grace. Here you are. You're about to have your 5th child.
Yes, it's been a very, I'd say, an overwhelming experience becoming a father. I guess that's for all fathers, but my wife and I have been very lucky and very blessed that we've never struggled to have children. We've had them quite easily, actually. So it's something that neither of us have taken for granted. We've been very thankful for it. We've got a well-balanced family at the moment. We've got 2 boys and 2 girls, and it moves along the way. So our oldest is 8 years old. Our youngest is almost 3. So now next one is due in December later this year.
Wow, he or she might just come on my birthday.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be good. Well, coming back to families, there was a time though when you might have been just more interested in yourself. Your identity would have been what?
Absolutely. So this was before I met my wife. I was in my early 20s, typical university student. And when I graduated out of university, went into the private construction and building sector. And that's the sector it does have a reputation of being very highly intense, very high stress, which indeed it is. But that formed and shaped my own self-identity. So I was very motivated career-wise and used that as a yardstick or a gauge of how I saw and valued myself, but also how I saw and valued others. And it's probably a hidden blessing now that I didn't know my wife or some of my close friends back then, because I was a very different person. But I wouldn't say better or worse. I'd say less formed and less mature than what I am hopefully now. But that influence of my colleagues around me in the sector that I was in did have what I would consider an adverse or over-influential bearing on just my life philosophy as such, and how I sort of prioritise things in my daily life. Okay,
so you were more of a Golan back then, sort of my precious, and the emphasis was on my, was it?
Yes, absolutely. So I was very interior focused and looking at what am I hoping to achieve in my life? What are my goals, which aren't bad in and of themselves, but it was I'd say a temporal gratification as a primary goal for what I hope to achieve. Again, not something unusual for someone in their early 20s. Look, I'm going to have nice house, nice car, overseas holiday every year, those sort of goals, if we want to call them that. But but the thing with me was they became a goal in and of themselves, an end in and of themselves, and the end justified the means. So I did neglect certain relationships in my life through family, friends I'd had for a number of years to achieve that goal. And it was it became almost a parasitic influence on my life, where it started eaten away at relationships I had, social networks I had, and I don't mean social networks like Facebook and Twitter. It was friends that I lost contact with, like very close long-term friends I lost contact with, and that does have, I suppose the one positive we can draw from that is you start taking stock of your life, thinking, well, where am I heading now? What's happening in my life for me I'm losing these friendships that I highly value. I'm not as close to family members as I used to be, as I should be, and that becomes a motivation to start looking internally for what are my goals, what are my priorities, where do I want to be in next year, the next 10 years, etc.
That existential dilemma.
Absolutely.
Yes. Now, you did some reading, and two writers in particular influenced you, and it helped to change your focus. Who are those books?
Okay, so I suppose the book that's had the greatest influence on me is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas, and people find it quite interesting when I say that, because they say, look, it's especially a lot of them haven't read the book, they've seen the movies, and Hollywood, like most things, it does action up and overly dramatise a book, and that book can get quite dry from a action perspective, but it's that underlining message of that the main protagonist in the movie, Edmond Dantes, sought revenge for himself, sought retribution for those that had wronged him, and he comes to this conclusion in the end, almost an epiphany, thinking, these are all the people I've hurt along the way. In me seeking revenge, in me seeking retribution to satisfy my needs, I've hurt all these people along the way. And while I've never had a sort of a journey of retribution as such, it is a great awakening for me personally, where you stop and think, well, who have I, how do I look at things in life, the people I've hurt, the people that have hurt me. The next one quickly is The Lord of the Rings, and you see the life philosophy and even the theology of Tolkien come through that story, and how we can be so easily corrupted, and it's that primary message that has had a profound impact on me.
Well, hold that thought. You're watching Support Life, and we'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Baulch, and my guest today is Daniel Attard. Daniel, we were talking about a couple of influential books. The first one, The Count of Monte Cristo, was banned. We've moved on to Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. Tell us more about its influence. Okay,
so Tolkien, who was actually a great student of theology and philosophy, and that really comes through strongly in his books. And for those and a lot of us are familiar with the story, even if we haven't read the books, we look at, it's basically a war focused around this special ring. It's a ring of power, and we see how all sorts of groups from different areas of Middle Earth and even different species, obviously it's a fantasy book, influenced, crave the power of the ring, corrupted by it in many circumstances, and where I suppose the greatest influence in the book is one of the final things, where there's two hobbits, two little creatures, I guess we'd call them midgets now, where one of them, Samwell, says to Frodo, I can't carry the ring for you because it's Frodo's job to carry the ring, but he goes, but I can carry you. And it's that sort of mentality and philosophy that is really ingrained right throughout the story, that I may not be able to do the job for you, for want of a better term. I can't carry your cross, but I can carry you. And that's the underlying philosophy is something that's been a great influence on my life, particularly in recent years.
So Daniel, this paradigm shift from I, me and myself, reading the book, looking at what's going on here about Frodo and carrying you and all of these sorts of things. When you get married and have a child, is this where the paradigm shift kind of moves from you to others? It
does. So, and it sort of started with a sort of temporal or earthly situation. So my wife and I got married, and 10 months later we had our firstborn child, so it happened relatively quickly. But when my wife stopped working, preparing for the birth of our first child, then it has that, you're presented with that earth reality that now you are, again, it's always used that term, the sole breadwinner. And so you have this existential, I wouldn't say crisis, but this query in and of yourself saying, there are other people that are relying exclusively on me. I'm essentially the umbilical cord to provide the temporal and earthly needs for my wife and obviously a very vulnerable newborn child. And so you start asking yourself, well, what's motivating me now? What are my needs? But needs from a paternal perspective, from a spousal perspective. So you look at how am I going to meet those needs that are really necessary? So you separate your needs and your wants, and how am I going to meet those needs, but meet them in such a way that they demonstrate a right way of doing things, a moral and ethical way of doing things for my wife and children. So that demonstration becomes an ongoing daily lesson in and of itself to my wife and children. I fail at it most days, but all you can do is pick yourself up and keep trying.
Okay, I'm glad that you pick yourself up and keep trying. If there are women in particular asking those deep questions and there's an unexpected pregnancy come along, you've been doing some study and reading some studies that have taken place, and it's about options. Tell me about that.
So quite often while technically we may have a spectrum of options that we can take in life, for this case, an unwanted or unplanned pregnancy, a woman who very typically is in a highly emotionally vulnerable state. They may also have other externalities that are influencing their decision, like they don't have any permanent place to live. They may have family pressure, which may have some sort of reputational baggage attached to it. So they're influenced in their decision-making process by what their current situation is. And this is where us as a society need to start trying to assist these people that are in highly vulnerable situations, because from my perspective, from the women I've spoken to that have had unplanned and unwanted pregnancies, the decisions they've made, they've said, look, I may have made that same decision, I may have made a different one, but I would have liked to have had a genuine plethora of options available to me. But in reality, those options weren't available to me. And I think that's a great shortfall and failure from a societal perspective, that we don't provide that. It's very easy to say, look, these are your options, go and make your decision. But in reality, especially when there's life at stake, we need to make these options much more available and much more widely known, so those people in that state can make those decisions.
All right, if I was to say there's sort of three looming options out there, IVF if you can't have a child, having difficulty, you didn't have difficulty there.
Yes, absolutely.
Adoption and then abortion. So what's missing? Is it time? Is it more information? What's gone wrong? I
think it's a information challenge where we have, to use an economic paradigm, we've got the supply and the demand side. So we've got so many families out there that often they wait years and even in some cases decades to adopt a child, even take them in temporarily, whether it's through foster care or a longer term solution such as permanent care. We've got the supply side, if you will, and I try not to reduce life to a commodity, but we've got the supply side of women who are pregnant and they've made the decision that they can't provide a ongoing loving household and life for that child. So they say, well, what am I going to do with this child? And quite often they're steered towards abortion. And then we've got a moral dilemma, if we want to call it that, through IVF, which commodifies life, and that brings with it financial challenges to government, because a lot of those IVF services are funded through government. So if we can get that needs of the mother who is vulnerable with her pregnancy, and we bring the needs of the families that want to provide that ongoing household want to provide a ongoing loving household to a child, if we can bring those two parties together, that would be a near silver bullet to that issue.
Well, now that's interesting. So we're going to hold that thought and we'll pick it up. You're watching Support Life, and we'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Baulch, and my guest today is Daniel Attard. Daniel, we were talking about options and bringing some of the parties together. We have supply and demand. We don't like using those words, but they certainly suit. There's a cost factor too, we've touched on. How do you bring them together?
So obviously that would have to be facilitated by government with the number of parties involved, and that would create that would need a great cultural change on behalf of the government. If I can go back in time for a bit, when John Howard was Prime Minister, Bronwyn Bishop actually led a parliamentary inquiry into adoption practices throughout the respective state and territory human services departments, and found there was a very strong anti-adoption philosophy as such throughout these departments, throughout their policies, throughout their procedures, and the numbers bear that out. When you look at the number of, say, something like abortions to the number of children made available for adoption, it is quite stark. There's in Victoria, there's actually well under 100 adoptions a year, where throughout Australia there's between 80 and 90,000 abortions every year. So that doesn't include the amount of children, the tens of thousands of children across the country that are in foster care, that are in permanent care. And so there's a great breakdown of the system as such, where everyone wants the same thing. No one wants to see a child in a vulnerable or a dysfunctional household. It's how do we best bring about a policy or procedure or some sort of program where we can get these parties together, that we've discussed those vulnerable women and also the families that are able to look after the child on a long-term basis, providing a loving family, bringing them together and satisfying the needs and the wants of all the parties involved. And quite often, and this has come through very strong in the women I've spoken to that have considered it, and even those that have gone through with abortions, is that they were in a highly emotional state, and it was this idea that there was no other option for them, despite, again, as we've discussed before, where technically they did have these other options there. The information wasn't readily available, or how do you access them? What do they entail? Is there any sort of emotional baggage involved with that? And a lot of them express this notion that what really, it was a fear factor going into the great unknown with adoption. What sort of household would the child end up in? They'd say, look, I'd rather have an abortion than my child go into a dysfunctional household. Then it sort of becomes a self-defeating purpose. So if we can allay those fears, if we can provide a genuine mechanism where women can feel empowered, that they can make this decision, it can be a self-driven decision, and we can connect them to these loving, stable families that can allay those fears that those women have. I think it's going to be one of those situations where it's just an all-round positive achievement.
Yes. I'm going to come back to your left arm, which has a little bandage on it.
Yes.
You've given something recently.
Well, earlier today I actually donated some plasma through the Red Cross Blood Service. So try to do that once a fortnight, and it's just one of those little things that they can help out. Obviously you don't get paid for it. It's just one of those little things where you sit there on a couch and read the newspaper for 45 minutes. But it's a very strong donating culture. Obviously through that they rely exclusively on blood donations, but you see the real world effects of it. If you ever been into a blood bank, you go through it, and it has posters of those that have had leukemia, have had different sorts of cancer, especially, and I found out today actually they use plasma products to manufacture infant vaccinations, that I did not know. So if we can do those little things, and I do my best to, I can always do more. It's those things, they bring a great deal of satisfaction for me that I've done I like to think of it as a selfless good deed, but something giving back to a society that's given me so much.
Okay. It's a pity that that same culture you've just expressed isn't there for when a woman has an unexpected pregnancy, where there's this openness to give a little, the information's there, it's readily available, and you're immersed in a very positive culture. How might that work if we use the blood bank model?
I suppose it's people wanting to give without expecting anything in return. So I've heard it being suggested before, well, why don't we provide some sort of financial compensation for women who are pregnant and want to abort their children or give them up to adoption, offer some sort of financial compensation. So basically create a baby market you would be doing in effect, and that would be quite a negative and adverse effect, because it would effectively commodify a child's life, and that's something that we don't want. And we saw that with baby Gammy, the IVF surrogate child in Southeast Asia, where the child ended up having Down syndrome when she was born, and it was viewed as almost like a defective product because you've purchased this child. It's like buying a new car with a scratch on it. You've purchased a product that you want to be pristine and new, but life isn't like that. There's no guarantees with life. Like my wife is expecting our 5th child later on this year, so there's no guarantees with that. That child may have a disability, a disease, a condition, and it's, I suppose, the most underlying philosophy is to accept things unconditionally, do things with no strings attached, with no reward expected. And I think that's the philosophy we need to adopt more, especially in Australian society.
So love and grace and mercy, faith, compassion. What's another word that we don't like today? It's probably being content with what we have.
Absolutely. So, because we very much compare ourselves to what other people have, what other people are doing. It's that old adage of keeping up with the Joneses. And we may have a nice, secure house to live in. We may have a car that functions perfectly well, but we look next door, they've got a flashier car, they've got a bigger house, they've got a wider screen TV, and we say, well, gee, I wish I had that. I'm lacking things. And it's that never-ending almost a malcontentment in a way. It's not just a yearning for more, it's a yearning for more, but drawing, if I can use the term, darkness within that. We're not happy with what we have.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel, for that last dark thought.
Thank you.
You've been watching Support Life, and that's all for our program today. Join us again next week. Goodbye.